Hello, and welcome to episode 62 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Bobonis, and joining me today is multi-award-winning journalist and author Ehud Yaari, visiting expert at the Australia, Israel, and Jewish Affairs Council. Ehud Yaari, how are you?
Fine, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. I'd like to start out with Israeli politics, something that those of us on the outside, it's a complete mystery to us, and hopefully you can shed some light on it. We all know that Benjamin Netanyahu is finally out of office after, I think, more than a decade scraping through and somehow staying in power. What can we expect from the new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett?
Yes, thank you, Salvatore. Mr. Bennett is going to be Prime Minister for a limited period, according to the coalition deal made between 8 different parties: extreme right, extreme left, and an Arab party, which is very close to the Muslim Brotherhood. A very strange combination, which we never had before. According to this deal, Mr. Bennett will be Prime Minister for 18 months, and then he will be replaced by the current Foreign Minister, Mr. Yair Lapid. It's very difficult to reach consensus or even obtain majority in a government which consists of so many different parties. And this is the bet of Mr. Netanyahu. He's now regrouping. He's not fading out. He's storing the Likud, his party's branches, recruiting more members to the party, because he believes that the government will not hold more than a year or so. I'm not sure he's right, because they have managed now to pass a budget, which he couldn't and wouldn't do for the past few years. But he's counting on early elections. One more word, if I may. Mr. Bennett, who is on the far right, is proving over the past few weeks that he's becoming much more flexible on many issues, including COVID. And he's seeking, for example, a renewed dialogue and understandings with the Palestinian Authority.
Right. I mean, from a policy standpoint, is there really any difference between Bennett and Netanyahu? I mean, they were at one point partners. Isn't that true?
Yes, Bennett started his political career. He comes from high tech. He made what we call an exit, made a few $1 million, and served out of ideological conviction as chief of staff of Bibi, when Bibi was still in opposition. So there is a very close acquaintance between these two, but not much friendship. Bennett was always critical of Bibi's reluctance to take measures towards annexation or strengthening Israeli hold on the West Bank. He was critical of the way that Bibi was running confrontations with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But now, as happens very often, what you see, we have a saying in Hebrew, what you see from here, the Prime Minister's office, you didn't see from there, the opposition benches. And you see a remarkable change in his attitude.
And just for anyone who may be a little lost, Bibi is the nickname for Benjamin Netanyahu. Where does that nickname come from, by the way?
That's the way they used to call him when he was a child in Jerusalem. He had a reputation of being the strongest kid in Jerusalem. Later was Commando, by the way, Bennett too, in the same unit. They are both coming from the elite Israeli version of the SAS, like another prime minister before, Mr. Ehud Barak. One second.
We'll let him silence his phone there for a second. It
Sorry.
is,
I'm
no
sorry.
problem, no problem at all.
I'm sorry.
Look, there, so it's really interesting, that connection between elite military service and leadership in Israel. Is that something that's limited to the conservative side of Israeli politics, or something that pervades the entire system?
Oh no, usually left-wing parties, for example, were also keen on having successful generals, prestigious generals like the late Yitzhak Rabin. I'm sorry about that. Taking the parties. So we had quite a few ex-chiefs of staff of the army in charge. And this is true also for the right. In recent years, one can notice that the appeal of generals in politics has declined. And parties on both ends of the political spectrum are looking for different kind of leadership. Mr. Bennett is a good example, because he was a junior officer in the army, and Mr. Lapid, the next prime minister, who is the strongman in this coalition, is somebody who served his compulsory service in the army as a correspondent for the Army's Weekly.
That's a funny route to leadership, but a well-trodden one in England, certainly. Look, there's been another election in the area, and that's in Iran, where I believe Ebrahim Raisi is going to take office as president tomorrow. Iran looms very large in Israeli politics. Could you walk our viewers through, why is Iran so important for Israel?
Iran is trying for years now to build a ring of fire, a wall of missiles, dozens of thousands of missiles, the best that they can produce or obtain around Israel. They've done it with Hezbollah, with 140,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon. They are furnishing Hamas, first with the equipment, but now with the know-how to produce more advanced, more precise rockets, as we saw during the last round of hostilities. They are trying to build a war machine of their own on Syrian territory. And this is where you have the constant strikes by the Israeli Air Force against Iranian and Hezbollah targets, trying to disrupt this effort. But I must admit that, at least in my opinion, it didn't stop the Iranians, and they are continuing. Without going into details, there is now a battle over the main city of southern Syria, which is quite close to Israel and practically on the border of Jordan. And I think it's going to be taken over by allies of Iran, which is not good news for Israel. I believe, I'm going straight to the hardcore. I believe that with the ascension of Ebrahim Raisi to the presidency, we are witnessing the completion of a process of transformation of the Islamic Republic. It's a transformation because from now on, the Islamic Republic is ruled by the Revolutionary Guard Corps and not by the mullahs. It's dramatic, but it has taken so long that people did not pay attention. And there are two recent developments in the past 2 weeks that do not get, in my humble opinion, enough attention in the international press, certainly not in the American press. One, I believe that there are good indications that Iran does not intend to reach an agreement with the US on resurrecting the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. It's quite clear to me now that it will take almost a diplomatic miracle for a deal. That's a decision of the Iranians and the supreme leader. It's not worth it. We can go into the details, but it's not worth it. So this is a situation. If it's true, then Mr. Biden is going to face a different lay of the land in the region. The second very important development in Iran is that they are coming to making a declaration that their strategic patience, that was the motto of the supreme leader of the past few years, is over. And you see the attacks on ships in the Gulf of Oman, outside the Persian Gulf. This is a different Iran.
Now, let me take just a moment to say a quick hello to Anthony and Chris. Thanks for watching live. Any of you who are watching live, please do feel invited to get your questions into the chat window on YouTube, and we will get to them as soon as we can. Ehud, I was really interested to hear what you said about the conflict between the Revolutionary Guards in Iran and the mullahs in Iran. For those of us on the outside, we just, I think of all of this as the same thing, right? It's all Islamic fundamentalism. There's no difference. Could you explain to those of us who are not Iran experts how this politics has evolved and what it means for the future?
Power has moved over the past 2 decades, gradually, from the hands of the clergy to the hands of their disciples, because most of the generals, the top commanders of the Revolutionary Guards have graduated from religious seminaries, such as the Haqqani Seminary in Qom and others. And step by step, power shifted from the hands of the mullahs, who were not very capable in running a very complicated state like Iran, to the hands of the generals. So you have now a situation in which an organization, let's say the Revolutionary Guards, count maybe 180,000 men in uniform, but they have around them a whole field of economic companies, corporations, etc., to the point that they really control much of the Iranian economy, certainly the sectors that count. So they are paying the respects to the clergy. They manifest loyalty to the rulings of the clergymen, but real power has moved to their hands. You could maybe people noticed the speech of the outgoing President Rouhani the other day. What did he say? He said, Parliament in Iran, controlled by the Revolutionary Guards, prevented me from renewing the deal with the US.
And what does it mean for the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran's nuclear capabilities, or the development of an Iranian nuclear bomb? What does it mean for this, that the Revolutionary Guard are more in charge instead of the clerics?
The Revolutionary Guards were never enthusiastic about the nuclear deal. They felt that Iran should of a bomb, and they have tried in almost any way possible to subvert the attempts of the administration of Rouhani with his smiling foreign minister Zarif to get to an understanding with the Americans. It's a no-no for them. Now they feel that if negotiations were to continue with the Americans, then they have to negotiate not a renewal of the old agreement from 2015, but a new agreement which will take into account the advances that Iran made in its nuclear preparations. This is unacceptable to the Americans, and the Americans are setting their own terms. We have, in fact, reached a point where both parties, the US and Iran, are saying we have to negotiate a different deal, but they cannot agree on what type of a deal.
Thanks for that. And let me remind everyone that the CIS is a membership-supported organization, so there's no government money involved and no sponsored research at the Center for Independent Studies. What keeps the CIS independent is the support of members like you. So there is that support link in the chat box. We'd love to have a contribution if you're in a position to offer one. Ehud, we have a question from Chris about the likelihood of further attacks by the Israeli Defense Forces on Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, that's assuming that the previous attacks have been orchestrated by Israel. Could you shed some light on this? The Israel's security relationship with Iran and the likelihood of future Israeli attacks potentially on Iran itself?
Well, since I'm not an official, I can probably be very open about it. There is no doubt that the Israelis, both the army and the intelligence agencies, were doing a lot, attempting to disrupt, slow down the Iranian nuclear program. It's clear to the Iranians, I'm quoting the Iranians now, that there is a presence going for years of Israeli intelligence in force within Iran, which manifested itself in the attacks on installations like Natanz, in the assassination of nuclear scientists. The last of them was the head of the nuclear program, Fakhrizadeh, in the stealing the nuclear archive from the center of Tehran, etc. And the Israeli army is mounting attacks on the Iranians in Syria, as I've mentioned before, and also acts against Iranian shipments at sea, which has broadened the scope of the collision. I personally believe that the Israelis are, whoever is the prime minister, if the Israelis reach the conclusion that the Iranians are getting close to a bomb, they will act. Now, to give an example, if you go to have vacation, not these days, in Europe, you go to Sardinia, you go to Bulgaria, you go to Greece, many other places, you will see squadrons of the Israeli Air Force. What are they doing there? They are training on this distance of 1,500 kilometers that they have to go in order to reach the Iranian nuclear installations in Iran. It's important to note that the Israeli government has just approved a significant amount of additional budget for the military for preparations for Iran. And the Chief of Staff, General Kochavi, on one occasion said there are three options: a bigger one, a medium-sized attack, or a small one, which the Israeli army has been preparing for years. I hope we don't get there, but it may happen.
Now, of course, in the Western press, and particularly in the American press, we focus so much on the Israel-Iran conflict, the relationship, because it has the potential to flare up because of its political sensitivity for many Americans and other Westerners. But Iran, of course, also has relations with other Eurasian powers. And we have a question from Christopher about what extent Russia will cooperate with Iran. And I may broaden that out to ask, to what extent is China cooperating with Iran?
Yeah, thank you. I think in Syria, for example, we see that the Russians rely on Iranian proxies that provide the infantry for the small contingent of the Russian Air Force that is active in Syria. So there is very close cooperation. On the other hand, we see a lot of competition between the Iranians and the Russians over all sorts of economic advantages in Syria, whatever remains there. And the Russians are not so happy about the Iranians' activity close to Israel's and Jordan's border. I think what's the main issue now is Afghanistan. I mean, the immediate issue is Afghanistan. And the Iranians, who were no friends of the Taliban in the past, certainly not. They viewed them as adversaries, even as enemies. They are trying to mend fences with the Taliban. Seems that they have a degree of success in that. But more important, we see China reaching understandings with the Taliban. And the Taliban apparently already committing themselves not to support the Uyghur organizations in Xinjiang. What I think we may see, that's my suspicion, is we will see in Afghanistan, China stepping into the void, Iran stepping in the east around Herat at first, and sort of a set of understandings between China, Iran, and Pakistan over how they are going to handle the Taliban, assuming the Taliban will reach Kabul at one point, I'm not sure. But this will leave India in a very awkward situation, and also the United States and others.
We have a follow-up question from Bruce about U.S.-Iran relations. He says, John Bolton wanted the U.S. to strike Iran after its attacks on shipping, but Trump stepped back from that. Why does the Biden administration want to reinstate the JCPOA despite continuing Iranian provocations?
I believe that the team, Biden himself, he was a strong supporter of the JCPOA at the time, to the point of threatening the AIPAC, the Jewish lobby in the United States. And his team, I happen to know some of them quite well, believe that a deal is a better way to slow down Iran or even prevent it from moving forward towards assembling a bomb than a military action. This is open for debate, but you have a strong conviction there. I believe that over the past months, Washington has understood that the Iranians are not going to play ball so easily, and they may not be interested in a deal at all. What do you do at that point?
Last week, we had William Maley, an Afghanistan expert, as our guest, and he was telling us about the Taliban strategy of taking over customs posts on the borders. And I believe the Taliban now control the main customs post on the Iranian border.
Mainly on the north, yeah.
Oh, okay. Those of us, who are outside the region have a very basic level understanding that in Islam there's a split between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam, and that Iran is at odds with Sunni countries like Pakistan because of this split. Of course, the Taliban are Sunni Muslims aligned with Pakistan. Pakistan itself has a nuclear bomb. How much should we make of the Sunni-Shia split? I mean, is a potential Iranian bomb as much directed at Pakistan as it is directed potentially at Israel? How important is this religious split for geopolitics in the region?
I personally have been convinced for many years that there is some exaggeration concerning the political significance of the religious divide between these two schools of Islam. An example is that the Muslim Brotherhood, Sunnis, were the first supporters of the Shiite Islamic revolution in Iran. What I think will happen is, if the Iranians get closer to the bomb, you will see Turkey, Sunni, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, maybe even tiny UAE trying to go to take the nuclear path. And the second thing is, because the Iranians too do not like Middle East or Middle East mushrooming with nuclear bombs, they may want to be a screwdriver away from the bomb, but not go for a test. That would be a very, very difficult situation, because the Biden administration is saying that they would not let Iran become a nuclear power or acquire nuclear capability. But it's very worrying that they don't define what does it mean becoming a nuclear state, because there are many shades of gray here.
We have two quick questions before we end. We are rapidly running out of time, but we do have a question from Leor. He says, Shalom, Ehud. I would like to hear your thoughts on the pressures placed on Israeli-Western relations due to increased activism attempting to alienate Israel from its allies, or probably more accurately, trying to alienate Israel's historical allies from Israel. Is this a real threat?
I believe so. I believe that Israel has neglected its PR. It's partly because our foreign ministry was neglected for many years. And we have to do a lot about that. But also, we should be going, and I believe this is what we will see in the coming year, if the current government remains, is attempt to strike interim deals with the Palestinians. That's possible, which would probably improve the situation. But I think this is a real challenge for Israel and should be a top priority.
Thanks. And if we can impose on you for just a few more minutes, we did have a question from Christopher about the returning to Israeli politics. In spite of the apparent chaos in the Knesset, is it true that the center-right in Israel has a clear overall majority, and thus, in principle, once those personality conflicts may eventually get set aside, there is a governing consensus in Israel?
Christopher is absolutely right. There is a solid majority of center or even right of center. The divide in Israel over the past few years was, are you with Bibi or against? Are you with Mr. Netanyahu staying in power or against? And the coalition that was formed now, the government that we have now, is a government representing all those, including those on the right side of the map, who wanted Bibi out. But the morning after Bibi, when he departs politics at one point, there is a clear right-wing majority in Israel, I would say to the tune of easily 60%.
Well, Ehud Yaari, thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for joining us today on Liberty.
My thanks, Shen. Thank you. My pleasure.
And thank you also to Nico Malian, our producer, executive producer Max Hawk-Weaver, the director of CIS's Tom Switzer. Thanks all of you for watching. Next week, join us to hear Jordan Williams on of the New Zealand Taxpayer Alliance to talk about the New Zealand economy. I'm Salvatore Babonis, and I hope you will see us next week on Liberty.